So Touqueville, whenever I talk about Touqueville, I always start in with what is it that is the problem for Touqueville? And it's the French Revolution and the inability of France to find any kind of stable political system that can work across time. And what's happened in France? They can't go back to the old aristocracy because they liquidated it. So they no longer have this aristocratic base for a feudal monarchy or for something which would in some way incorporate or call back to bits and bobs of that old regime. But each time they try to get away from monarchy and construct some kind of republic, they find that that doesn't work either. They're not able to actually keep together the population for any length of time. It fragments, it infights, and so some king or emperor ends up becoming the solution to this period of anarchy. And so France keeps going back and forth between despotism and anarchy. And there's this question, is there some other way? Is there some other social base that can be constructed that might be functional for France? And a lot of the French liberals at the time are looking at the British system and going, is it possible to graft that on to maybe create something like that in France? And part of what the whole democracy in America mission is to take a look at how the American system is working and to think about to what degree is this something that can actually work? And is it a model? Is it something you could do in France? So as Tocqueville is looking at it, there's a focus on how it works, but there's also a focus on what are the conditions for it, and does France have those conditions? So the major conditions are this democratic society, a society where it actually does seem to be the case that there's a rough equality in terms of political power, which is, of course, connected to, but not quite the same as, a rough equality in terms of the economy. So you don't have enormously huge inequalities economically or politically in the United States in the first half of the 19th century, especially if you're comparing the United States to the European powers at the same time. And this produces, if you think about today, we have a big chunk of the population with a university education and a big chunk of the population without a university education. And we have a bunch of billionaires, a bunch of incredibly rich people, and then lots of people who have no property at all, who don't even own any farmland. This is a time period where there's lots of small landholders in the United States, lots of small merchants, crafts. What we would call capitalism has not been firmly established in the United States yet. So you still have something that looks like a commercial society with small farmers, small merchants and landholders. There are a few relatively well-to-do rich people, but these people are nothing like as rich as we would subsequently get. And you don't have the old nobility or the old church as you still had in many European empires at the same time. So you have this appearance of a kind of relatively homogeneous demos that is relatively homogeneous in terms of its life experience and is therefore able to have a discussion within itself. And so one of the major questions even at the time is whether something like that exists anywhere else on Earth. And can that be sustained for any length of time? So even insofar as it seems to work in the United States, can it continue to work? Or will this demos eventually fracture and fragment and become more and more inegalitarian? And if this happens within the social and political base, if the economy becomes more stratified, and political influence also becomes more stratified along with that, will you still be able to have the same kinds of mechanisms function? And if you don't have the same kinds of mechanisms functioning at the social level, will the state, the federal state, have to become more involved in some way to counteract these emerging inequalities and emerging splits? And if that happens, then won't power become centralized around the federal state? And if power becomes centralized around the federal state, would that be really altogether different from power being centralized around the King of France or the Emperor of France? And if that were to happen, wouldn't the United States then replicate in a somewhat different form the same series of problems which France has been having? And so while Tocqueville is interested in democracy in America and excited about it, he also has these concerns. And these concerns, I think, are really a major part of why Tocqueville is as intriguing as he is. And it's in part because Tocqueville is this aristocratic French guy who has a certain level of remove that he's able to see both what's distinctive, weird, and different about the United States, how it's not like a European country in ways that are kind of exciting, but also the fragility of it, the conceits of it, the degree to which it doesn't recognize that what it has made is fragile and prone to internal trouble. The usual critique of democracy is that to have it function well, it requires a very, very contingent and difficult to sustain situation. And then as soon as that situation starts to get out of control, you have to make some kind of intervention into it. Now, this is if you're understanding democracy in terms of a rough equality of economic and political power. Once you start to understand democracy in other ways, like, say, just competitive multi-party elections that guarantee elite circulation, then you can say that you have a healthy democracy without any of this stuff, really, that Tocqueville talks about. And one of the things we see in the 20th century is a move toward this more elite theory understanding of democracy as a mechanism for circulating elites rather than a mechanism for allowing a demos to rule.